Let's first of all understand what a service worker actually is. Now, this is how our JavaScript code typically behaves. It runs in a single thread. That means our web application, which can consist of multiple pages, or in the case of an Angular app with one page only, this app often uses JavaScript. And if you're using Angular, you're of course using JavaScript because Angular uses JavaScript. So this JavaScript code, the entire Angular app, runs on one single thread. And JavaScript has its features to still handle asynchronous code and not block the execution. But this is all normal JavaScript. Now, JavaScript and the browser also offers us to run an additional thread. We can run a so-called web worker, and a special form of that is the service worker, on another thread. So this still then uses one and the same thread, but it's a different thread than your main JavaScript code. And the important part is that this thread is kind of decoupled from your HTML pages. So this means that this can also continue running in the background, for example, on your mobile phone. That is something mobile browsers typically offer. This can continue running, and it could therefore also do advanced things like receive push notifications. Take my full progressive web app course if you want to learn more about this. But one other crucial thing that a service worker can do is it can manage all your different pages in case you got multiple pages, or your single page if you're building an Angular app, and it can listen to outgoing networks requests. So it can listen to requests going out of your web page. For example, if you're fetching the assets of that web page, the CSS code, the font, the JavaScript, or also data from an API. The service worker can catch these outgoing requests and do something with them, like, for example, cache the responses in a special cache storage, or then also return these cached responses back to your page so that it also works if you got no internet connection. Of course, only if there is a cached version available. This is what the service worker does. It can be seen as a proxy between your app, your front-end app, and the HTTP request you're sending to the backend. It proxies that request, which means it catches it, does something with it, and might then allow it to still go on and leave the app, but it could also block this. Now, configuring such a service worker and writing it from scratch is something you can do, and something you'll learn in my full progressive web app course. There you also learn about features like push notifications and so on. For this video, we'll focus on how Angular can easily add such a service worker to our Angular app, because it turns out that there is a special package we can install. For that, let's quit ngserve, and now here it's important that you're using the latest CLI version for that project, and this project does. And then you can run ng-add to add a third-party package, but that's more than just a NPM library, really some functionality to your app. And only some features can be added, because essentially this will execute a command which has to be defined by whichever package you are targeting. So not even close, not every third-party library supports this feature. But there is a special library which does support it, which you can target with @angular/pwa. And if you run this will actually configure your existing project to use the Angular service worker package and start with a pre-configured service worker. So it does a lot for you. You can already see it added some things to the index.html file, like the no script section to give a warning if JavaScript is turned off, because we need that, of course. We need it turned on. It loads this manifest here, which it also generated. Now, that is important for actually having a launcher icon for your app. If you have it on a mobile phone, you can even save it to the home screen and then start it with that. And you can define which icon that should use and so on. So that is the manifest.json file. Again, learn more in that course I mentioned. For us, interesting is the app module. Because in the app module, we are using a service worker module, which is imported from @Angular service worker. And this is really an official package of the Angular framework. And it does what it sounds like. It registers a service worker, which will be that proxy that catches outgoing requests and does something with them. And you will learn how to configure what it does to them later in this video, of course. We use it here by calling the register method, and there we target the ngswworker.js file, and you won't find that file here. And the reason for that is that this file will actually be auto-generated. It will be generated during the build process, and it will be in the dist folder, therefore, and it will hold your service worker, which will contain a lot of functionality which you don't have to and typically don't want to write on your own. And here it's also configured to only be added if you're building for production. In the assets folder, we see some icons were added for that manifest.json file. And in the root project folder, we see that in the package.json file something changed. For example, the Angular PWA package was added, which includes that Angular service worker package. And we got this ngsw config file. This is the file where you can configure that service worker which will be generated, but we'll take a closer look at this in a second. The angular.json file, which manages the CLI project, also was adjusted a little bit. There, service worker is set to true for the production build. This is required because the service worker will cache certain resources, and to ensure that the new build updates the service worker, these resources will contain a hash, and that will then also be injected into the service worker, which is why we need to make the build process aware of the fact that we need a service worker. This is how that works. Now let's simply see that in action. Let's create a production build by running ng build -- prod. And this will now bundle and optimize the entire app, use ahead of time compilation, and so on. And it will spit out our Angular app in a dist folder, and there we should then also see the service worker. So let's have a look. If we close the source tab here, let's refresh. Here's the dist folder, the Angular PWA folder for the project. And there we see that ngsw worker.js file. You remember, that is the file we are importing in the app module here. We're registering it here. So this can be found in the dist folder indeed. If we have a look at it, you see there's a lot of code in there because, well, it's actually pre-generated for you to do all that caching and so on in a very efficient way. And now let's simply see what it does. And for that, you need a web server you can run to host your production app here. You could do that with ngserve -- prod, but there you will actually not see the service worker in action correctly because it will only build it in memory. So therefore, what you should do is install a lightweight node server, and thankfully there is one. You can install it with npm install -g to install it globally, http server. This is a package you can use to launch a simple node-based server which will host the content of the folder you run the command in. And the command you need to run is just http -server. So let's navigate into our dist folder, and there in the Angular PWA folder, and let's run http server, and then you can assign a port with -p 8081, for example, and it will then bring this up, and now you can visit localhost 8081, and you should see your Angular app there. Now this app looks like a normal app. Now reload it once to make sure that the service worker can do its work, and go to application again. We should now see that under application, we got that ngsw worker running. And if you don't see that, try reloading that page one more time. Also make sure to clear the storage here entirely if you worked with service workers and this port served on your local domain before. Now you should see that. The interesting part is if I now tick offline again and I reload, it still works, right? We still see the same content as before, even though we're offline. Now, how can that work? If we go to the network tab and we clear it, and we now reload, we see we're making a bunch of requests here, and they're all essentially served from the ng service worker here. So from the service worker, this is all served. The interesting part is the posts request here probably, which is still kind of can connect to the outgoing server. For that, let's again disable Wi-Fi and let's try this again. And now this does not work, but what we can see still is that for one, there is a bug or an intended behavior in Chrome, which leads to these API requests still going through, even if we simulate offline mode. But more interestingly, we see a white page. We don't see that there is no internet connection error. Now, we would not just see a white page. We would see any content we add here if we load our page. So we essentially see everything that's hard-coded into our Angular app The dynamic content is missing. We'll take a look at this in a second, but all the hard-coded content is there because what we can see in the network tab is that we're loading the main page, the styles, not the font, but the styles, the JavaScript files, all that is loaded from the service worker. And the failing things are the font and our posts. Let me turn Wi-Fi back on and also leave that simulation mode, which didn't work too great, I guess. And now, of course, if I reload, it again works. And let's now change something. First of all, let's change something at the app component. There, I'll add a h1 tag where I say my posts. Now let's quit that HTTP server, go back into the main folder, and let's run ng-build --prod again. And let's see how this now changes the app and if I'm right regarding my statement that hard-coded content would be cached. So let's wait for this to finish, for that build to finish. And once it's finished, let's go back into that dist folder and there into that Angular PWA folder. And let's run our server command again. So HTTP server on that port. Let's reload the application here. And you might need to reload twice, and you should then see my posts. The reason for the double reload is that the service worker was loaded, and the service worker is aware of the fact that the index.html file changed, or that the script rendering content to it changed, to be precise, because of that hashing thing I mentioned. This hash table which is automatically generated and all the files having hashes, because by default it would of course fetch these resources from the cache, so we would see the old version. We don't want that, so we take the new version or we let us give the new version by using that Angular service worker package, which takes care about that hashing and the fact that the service worker is aware of the new version for us. So we got that. Now if I go offline again, you see that is also part of the loaded page, and if I go fully offline by turning off Wi-Fi, we still see that. So now the font and the API call, the API data is missing, I should say. So that is what I now want to change. And to change this and get that same page here when we're offline, as I'm getting when I'm online, we need to change the service worker config, which can be done in the ngswconfig.json file. Now in this file, you can configure how the Angular service worker behaves. So let's take a closer look.